Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Work From Home Show. Shout out to all our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. I'm Naresh, this with Adam Schrader. Today we have Oliver Burkeman on the show. He's a New York Times bestselling author of The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and the new book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. Oliver is a well-known columnist and reporter. He has worked for many internationally renowned publications. So without further ado, Oliver Burkeman, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, and let's start the discussion by just talking about your background. I did bring up that you have a background in reporting. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, just a quick overview of your career and how you wrote two incredible books.
Thank you. Well, I mean, the journalism part, I'm one of those terrible people who's wanted to be one thing since I was like 6 years old. And by the time I think I was at sort of 8 or 9, I was making my classmates receive sort of little newspapers that I was creating. I don't claim they ever read them, but I was sort of trying to be a journalist from a very young age. And then after college, I started working at The Guardian and The Observer newspapers in London. And eventually joined the staff there, did some reporting out of Washington, D.C. And New York. And then eventually, about a decade ago now, more than a decade ago, went freelance. And that enabled me to have the time to write books as well, which was sort of in some ways the next challenge. How much detail do you want me to go into? I can talk to you about the reporting that I did, but.
Well, how about this? How about we get right into your books? Let's
Sure.
talk a little bit about the time management book. That's called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. And part of the reason, but that book is very relevant to what I saw recently, some stats from the CDC. I don't know if you saw this. You very likely did. But the latest stats from the CDC said that the average human lifespan went down 1.5 years since the pandemic hit in March 2020. That's not, it's the first time I think in like a century where the lifespan went down. Usually it's been going up and it went down. It's not encouraging at all. So I want to get your thoughts on that statistic and also why that ties into your book, because if the lifespan is going down, we don't have much time left, and therefore time management becomes all the more important.
I think that's the real point. Yeah, no, I mean, I did see that statistic, and it's totally alarming. The title of the book, 4,000 Weeks, that's a very rough approximation of an 80-year lifespan in weeks. It's actually, you get a little bit more than 4,000 if you do live to be 80, and occasionally people live to get 5 or even 6,000 weeks, but those are kind of the record breakers at the end of that. I think the really important point here is just like, it isn't very much. And above all, it is finite. It has a limit. And I think that a huge amount of the time that we spend, a huge amount of the energy we put into sort of figuring out what to do with our lives, plus a huge amount of kind of productivity advice and self-help advice on time management, it doesn't really take into account this fact of limitation. It sort of encourages us to believe that with the right methods and enough self-discipline, we might manage to do everything that that's on our to-do list, or everything we might dream of doing. And it's just like the math doesn't work. So this book is really about how the challenge of time management changes, I guess, when you really take into account that finitude, that limitation.
So what do you, I mean, obviously people hear time management and they have their own thoughts on what that means. What does time management mean to you?
Well, I mean, part of what I wanted to do in this book, and part of the sort of humor, I hope, in the subtitle "Time Management for Mortals" is, it's this very sort of business-like, down-to-earth genre of like, how do you organize the hours of the day to stay on top of your email and to keep on top of your various projects. And then it's also kind of like the biggest existential question there is, right? In a sense, we're not doing anything here but time management on the planet. But you wouldn't guess that from what the associations people usually have with this phrase, which is very sort of maybe a little bit boring, a little bit routine. So I really wanted to sort of connect these things up again and say that, I'm not the very first to say it or anything, but like how we use the hours of the day, that adds up to the biggest question that there is, which is what you do with your life. So it was really making that connection that I wanted to focus on.
Before we get into specific tips that you recommend, I just want to share my own time management.
Yeah.
Not expertise, but tips that I have, because we've had listeners reach out to us and say, wow, how do you run this podcast? Plus, both of us are stay-at-home dads. Adam has 4 kids. I have 1 infant. And then I run 2 profitable 6-figure businesses from home while taking care of my son pretty much full time.
Right. I want to hear the answer to this question too now.
And it's well, it's not. So here's the easy answer. It's not something that you read a book and you wake up one day and say, okay, I'm going to become this amazing time manager. It's something that I had to work on over time. So I spent my 20s, for example, building up my businesses, building up those contacts, so that when I'm in my 30s now and I have a kid, it's easier to do the work. Now, if I had gotten started with my businesses, if I did all the coaching or the learning and the training and all that, now I wouldn't be able to handle it. I simply would not be able to devote the time and the energy to learning and managing the household and paying bills. It wouldn't happen. But I put in that time early on. Mm-hmm. And so now where I am today in my early 30s, it's helped me be very efficient with my time, because I'm not wasting it. And the other thing I'd say with regard to time management is I outsource. And maybe this comes from my business background, hiring people to do the work, because that's the other thing. I hire people to do most of the work. I probably only do about 20% of the work for all my businesses. I have people who do the brunt of the work, and they do stuff that I don't even know how to do. And that helps you. Yeah, you have to pay them, but to me, it's worth it to pay them, because that frees up time. It helps me manage my time better. And with that time, I can do things like taking care of my son. I can do things like running, at least a mile every day, playing tennis or whatnot. So that's my long answer to what you asked.
I'm impressed. I'm super impressed.
So what are your tips? Those are my tips. Let's hear your tips.
Well, okay. I mean, so the first thing that your story makes me want to say to people listening is like, I do not disagree with anything that you said there. I think it's all deeply wise. On the other hand, I can imagine someone in their 30s or even beyond their 30s thinking like, that's all very well if I could rewind to my 20s and put all this time in now. And I mean, I suppose what I feel like the thing I have to contribute here is something that maybe applies to both situations, right? It would apply if you're in your 20s and wanting to build a basis for the future, or if you feel like you're sort of starting later on or something. It's a perspective shift, and I'm happy to talk about like specific tips and stuff. Sure. But I think it's really a perspective shift that just involves falling back down to earth, basically, with regard to time, and saying there are so many hours in the day, you have so many weeks remaining in your life, well, you don't know how many, obviously. And in this context, sort of trying to make yourself so efficient that you can do everything that is thrown at you, trying to make yourself so productive that you never have to make any tough choices about what things matter more than other things to you. Like that is like a fool's errand, because that it's encouraged by the sort of worst productivity and time management advice. I think that will keep you constantly chasing like a donkey chasing a carrot. You'll never get there. It'll always be next month or next year that you're going to finally have everything under control, and like then you're going to be able to focus on the things that really, really matter to you. And so part of this book, I think, is more like a manifesto for saying, like, you've got to do things that really matter to you right now. Doesn't mean that it's not a long game in a lot of areas of life. Doesn't mean you shouldn't like be taking baby steps in order to have a really successful business in a decade's time. But you've got to not fall into this idea that you're going to sort of clear the decks now, or you're just going to tread water for now, because the real time in your life is going to come in a while when you've got it all sort of, you've got it all in working order. I think another of the things that sort of speaks to this same idea is that we really want to try to do 20 projects at once. Not really because that's the most effective way of making progress at these projects, but because it makes us feel like we're in control of stuff and we know what we're doing and we've got a finger in every pie and we're taking care of business. So one of the sort of general outlooks that I really sort of hammer home here is about using all sorts of techniques, but basically all with the one aim of trying to limit your work in progress, right? Trying to limit to a very small number the number of big projects that you're working on at any one time, which takes a lot of sort of, it takes some fortitude, because it makes people anxious when they think they're neglecting like 9 out of 10 of the things that they care about in their work, say. But actually, I argue that, for all sorts of reasons, doing that and working on one of them and seeing it through to completion and then moving on to the next one is actually a way better recipe for making progress than this kind of distributing of your attention over too many things. And in a way, it sounds like that's what you're saying, right? You've taken a sequential approach to some degree. You've serialized big challenges in your life so that, to some extent, now some of them can take a backseat to other ones. And I think that's really wise.
And I want to mention, I was not born like this. I was a terrible time manager. Really, most of my childhood. It wasn't until I got to college and I felt a sense of independence, being away from home, right, and essentially paving my own path. I learned how to compartmentalize different areas of my life, the academics with the extracurriculars, with the social and personal, with the partying, and that helped me manage my time extremely, extremely well. Because when I was in high school, I remember I'd be in math class thinking about my physics exam the next day, and I'd be in
right,
basketball practice thinking about, something that someone said to me that I was upset about, and I just couldn't focus. Focus is so important, and to me, the compartmentalization, the focus, and doing what's in front of you. You brought up, for example, like having 100 emails. I'm the type of guy who, I know this sounds bad, but hey, it helps me. And that is, I'm on my phone checking my email like every 30 minutes and answering emails. And I go to sleep every night with a zero unread messages in my email inbox, because email is so important to my business, to what I do, to how I make money. So, and that's how it is with everything, whether it's Facebook messages or text messages, emails, voicemails that people leave. I go to sleep knowing, okay, I finished everything and I can go to sleep with a clean slate. And when I wake up, it's a new day and there's going to be more stuff to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think what you said about, the time for later is interesting, because whenever I remember reading an article recently or hearing an interview where they talked about how people oftentimes say like, oh, I'll start that when I'm retired. I'll write my book once I retire. I'll take up golf or tennis or do this, that, and the other.
Never happened.
And then they found, if you're not doing something before you retire, you're never going to, very few people pick it up after they do retire. So it's one of those things, if you're going to spend the first, 3,000 weeks of your life not doing something and hope to beat all of the odds and spend the last 1,000 weeks of your life doing it, it's kind of depressing to think it's never going to happen.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I love this insight that I got the phrasing of it from a creativity coach called Jessica Abel, which is, it's this piece of wisdom from personal finance, right? Very famous. Pay yourself first. If you want to save or invest money, take it out from your paycheck when you get the paycheck, instead of doing all your expenditures for the period and then hoping that there'll be some left over at the end. And she sort of says that, I think very wisely, that the same thing applies to time. If something really matters, and that could be your work, it could be something outside work, the only way you're going to make time for it is to make time for it kind of now, and to deal with the fact that a lot of other things will go undone, that, you know, more emails will come in while you're doing it, or some other project will get temporarily neglected while you're doing it. That's the only way to do that. Because if instead you adopt this approach of like, okay, I'm going to get all that other stuff out of the way, well, we live in a world of infinite inputs, right? No, you're never going to get everything else out of the way, because there's always going to be more things. And in fact, answering emails and dealing with all the things generates more things. So it's kind of a treadmill. So I think that, you know, this could come down to something as simple as the old wisdom to begin the day, spend the first hour or two of the day on something that you sort of care about the most, instead of first trying to clear the decks before you come down to it. These are all just sort of little implications of this one big point, which is like, we have brains that are capable of imagining an infinite number of achievements and accomplishments, and we have technology that is capable of bringing us an infinite number of emails and opportunities and obligations and all the rest of it. But we're finite, and time is finite. So tough choices is what it's all going to be about.
We have Oliver Burkeman, New York Times bestselling author of the new book, 4,000 Weeks. You just touched on priorities, because at the end of the day, what are you going to work on first? Well, we're going to prioritize, you know, the most important thing, most likely. You talk in your book about social media, and social media can be such a huge distraction. Where does social media fall in your spectrum of priorities and distraction?
I mean, it's a good question, because I sort of, like a lot of people, I tend to, as a sort of mental shorthand, categorize social media as something that's all bad and that I wish I never was on. And then at certain times, such as now, when I'm trying to spread the word about this book, you realize that's not a tenable proposition to say that social media is all bad. And it's not even, you know, even Twitter, it's not all negative, right? I also sort of tend to assume and think of Twitter as being full of people having horrible arguments with each other, and then I'm getting all sorts of wonderful messages that I would not get if I deprive myself of social media. I think I want to really, what I really want to do is be sort of studiously agnostic about the specific thing that is social media, and sort of turn people's attention a bit more to this question of why we are distractible, and why social media is a distraction if you in your best self would rather be doing something else with that hour, and it's not a distraction if your best self would be happy to be doing that with that hour. And I think that the real challenge is that we don't pay enough attention to the fact that we kind of want to distract ourselves from the things we care about the most. This is one of the points I try to unpack in the book. We think about social media as kind of coming and grabbing us, like we're sitting there working on an important piece of writing, and then, we just can't help it because Twitter sort of enters into our brain and yanks us away. And I think Silicon Valley does actually have a lot to answer for in terms of the way it sort of harnesses our attention in that way. But it wouldn't work unless we were collaborating, right? It wouldn't work unless actually what happens is I'm sitting there doing this piece of writing and I'm like, this is really painful. It's difficult. I'm intimidated by it. I'm not sure it's going to work out. I'm not sure people are going to receive it well. All these negative things are there, which are all to do with sort of confronting your limitations. And then the idea of going on Twitter is super fun compared to that, because you don't have to feel discomfort, and you just get to sort of lounge around in the sort of other world of cyberspace. So again, I think something that's really powerful there is just to become a little bit more tolerant of the fact that, like, important work and important jobs and being with kids and having difficult conversations in relationships, like, it comes with a bit of discomfort, and that's okay. And if you can get a bit better at not fleeing at the first sign of discomfort into something more comfortable instead, which is often social media, then I think you've sort of really gained a bit of a superpower. And then sure, you can still go and use social media, but not for that kind of avoidant reason, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I actually downloaded a thing for my computer called Leech Block that I block Facebook, and I don't do Twitter anymore. I did that years ago and hated it, so I didn't go down that rabbit hole. But from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., I can't get on it on my computer to avoid that time suck. So how do you talked about dealing with the discomfort? Do you have any tips for how people can learn to deal with and embrace those discomforting situations?
I mean, again, I'm always torn between saying, like, here's a tip and here's a technique, and I'll do that in 1 second, and saying that above all, it's sort of a question of feeling your way into a different attitude toward life. So it's almost like an expectation. I think writer's block is a great example here. All sorts of people complain about writer's block, which seems to mean that they sit down and write, and it's really uncomfortable, and they don't quite know what to write, and they're sort of struggling. But I feel like a lot of people who write professionally, including me, we don't really expect it to be any different than that. And then, lo and behold, writer's block isn't a problem because you've just sort of adjusted your expectations, and you sit down and, you feel that sense of cognitive difficulty that comes from doing something difficult. And it's almost, bracing. It's a bit like, lifting weights or something, right? It's not easy. If it was easy, you're doing. If lifting weights is easy, you're doing it wrong. So I think a lot of it is in that kind of perspective shift. I think there are specific sort of. I think one of the ways of sort of operationalizing this. Partly the things I mentioned about focusing on one thing, picking one major goal per life domain at a time, and just sort of staying with that, even when you feel anxious that you ought to be working on the other ones instead. And then I think if you really want to sort of practice with discomfort, that's basically another word, in a way, for meditation. And I try not to be a sort of tiresome evangelist for meditation, but I think it is a very helpful thing to try to build into your life if you can. I talk in the book specifically about something that a meditation teacher I know calls do nothing meditation, where you're not even trying to follow your breath. You're just literally sitting in a chair with a timer and doing nothing. And if you catch yourself doing something like thinking or looking around, you sort of stop doing that thing, and you just sort of practice not needing to do anything at all. And it's immensely powerful. I actually find it more powerful than breath-focused meditation, because it makes you realize how much of our lives are spent basically feeling vaguely uncomfortable about something and therefore jumping into action to, get rid of a feeling of hunger, or get rid of a feeling of boredom, or get rid of a feeling, whatever. It's really powerful intervention to just be like, oh, what if I just feel that discomfort for a little bit, and then it sort of fades away.
In your book, you talk about getting creative work done. You specifically called something the 3 or 4 hours rules for getting creative work done. What are those?
The 3 or 4 hour rule is just my shorthand for this extraordinary thing that a number of people have noticed looking through the routines and rituals of many, many famous authors and artists, scientists, mathematicians, which is like they really do only seem to do about 3 or 4 hours of hard, focused cognitive work in the course of a day. They may do plenty of other work depending on their situation. I think it helped to be sort of one of these 19th century scientific gentlemen where you could have servants do all the other things that needed doing in life. But you find mathematicians, for example, working for sort of 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours later in the afternoon in hard thought, and writers very frequently sort of starting at 8 in the morning, and by the time it's sort of 12:30, they're probably done with the deepest concentration of the day. And if there's people out there who think they can do it for 6 or 7 or 8, I don't want to be the person to dissuade them, right? I'm not trying to lower people's sights, but I think what the wisdom that's embodied there is just this kind of like, there is, again, we have limited time, you have lots of things you need to do in your life. If you try to turn yourself into the sort of perfectly optimized productivity machine, you're very likely to just attract a lot more incoming duties and inputs and sort of scatter your attention. If you sort of just say, look, I'm only going to ring fence 3 or 4 hours in the day, but I'm going to ring fence them. I'm going to make them the ones that are uninterrupted and where I'm expecting to focus on sort of taxing work. The progress that one can make is extraordinary. It's like the power of incrementalism there, of just adding, 1,000 words maximum, 800 words to a novel or a book. I mean, I'm using writing examples, but it doesn't only apply to writing, of course. The degree to which stuff piles up and productivity happens over that long haul, if you can just focus on protecting 3 hours. And lots of people feel like, I'm too busy, I can't just protect 3 hours, I need to protect 10 hours and work really, really hard at all of them. But I think it doesn't work like that. I think it works in this very incremental way, and you suddenly wake up, a few months later and find you've got far further than you would have predicted.
Oliver Burkeman is also the author of The Antidote: Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. I want to talk a little bit about that book.
Sure.
So let's start with happiness. So what is happiness to you, and why are people so fixated on being happy?
I think on some level it's totally understandable that we all want to be happy, because happy is just this placeholder word for like what we all want. And if you feel any dissatisfaction in your life, from the mildest through to, something much, much bigger, more serious, like, you think that the cure for that is to figure out how to be happy. One of the things I explore in that book, as you can tell from the title, is that, there's huge reason to believe, both from a personal experience and philosophy, but also from psychology studies, et cetera, that trying to cultivate happy feelings and thoughts is really counterproductive. That if you sort of try to manipulate the contents of your mind so that it's all upbeat stuff, it usually has the opposite effect, and fills it. And because you're sort of constantly monitoring for negative thoughts and trying to stamp them out, so you're always thinking about negative thoughts, and it's kind of a stressful way to be. I think that happiness is much better thought of as a byproduct of doing meaningful things that are meaningful to you. And I think we all have, don't we, that sense that there's something different between meaningfulness and happiness. Like, you can think of things that you maybe do in your life that make you feel fleetingly happy that you kind of think of as a waste of time. And then anyone who has had a small kid, let alone 4, knows that, there's all sorts of diaper changing work and being woken up at 2:30 in the morning work that is not, you're not happy in that moment. If somebody interrupted you in a psychology study via an app on your phone and said, between 0 and 10, how happy are you? It wouldn't be a high number, but it matters, and you feel like you're in the right place on the planet, I think, when you are, doing that. And I don't think it only applies to parents. I think this is, it's a very vivid example, but like, there's all sorts of work that we can find ourselves doing, and other activities that are not necessarily a thrill in that moment, but you feel like, okay, I'm in the right place. This is important, and it's important to me. So, I mean, I think that if you pursue that, the happiness comes along for the ride fairly frequently. And that's a really good, practical, achievable goal to have. I think if your goal is to sort of have an unbroken mind state of extreme cheer, you're sort of it's very brittle and fragile. You're sort of setting yourself up for a big fall.
Yeah, and I'll just say, similar to the time management, where people can work on improving their time management skills and creating more time. I think with happiness, you can do the same. You can work on being happier. And I think the worst thing a person can do is expect that something external is going to make them happy, that their job is going to make them happy, that the amount of money they make is going to make them happy, or their spouse, their wife, their husband is going to make them happy, or some award they get is going to make them happy. I think I believe it comes from within. You cannot expect the world to make you happy.
I would combine these two pieces of wisdom. I would say absolutely it comes from within, but secondly, it comes from within by pursuing meaning rather than by pursuing the feeling of happiness. And I think if you can combine those two things, I would say, in my opinion, you're onto a winner.
Yeah, going back to the time management, social media stuff, you coined the term the attention economy. What is the attention economy?
Well, I certainly didn't invent that term, but that refers obviously to this basic idea that, well, not obviously, but let me explain what it refers to. It refers to the idea that we live now in a world, in digital media above all, where what is valuable, the sort of currency of it is attention. So this very famous observation that if you're not paying for a product that you're using, like a social media platform, then you are the product, meaning that the platform makes its money by selling your attention to advertisers. This isn't brand new. I mean, way back to the invention of the penny press in the I guess it was the 19th century in America, the beginnings of the kind of newspaper that was sold for like a penny. So it was sold for less than it cost to produce. It was filled with lurid stories about like scandals and sex and like strange creatures being found on the moon and all sorts of like just crazy lurid stuff, so that lots of people bought it. And then the business model obviously was that the newspaper sold advertising space next to those stories to companies who wanted to reach readers. It's a completely legitimate way of organizing an economy, I think, but we're in this sort of warp speed, hyperdrive stage of it now, where the technologies used for making sure we see on social media platforms a sort of unending stream of the things that are personally tailored and calculated to grab our attention the most. I think that has become a real challenge because, it's like I quote the technology critic Tristan Harris in the book. He said, whenever you open up a social media platform, there are 1,000 people on the other side of the screen paid very high salaries to try to keep you there. So it's not a fair fight. Your attention is being harnessed, and lots of people are using absolutely extraordinary cutting edge combination of mathematics and psychology to know better than you know yourself what's going to keep you hooked. And so, we have to start thinking about our attention as a kind of a precious thing that we're responsible for. And I don't think that people did that like 50 years ago. I don't think anyone thought about attention in that way. So it's sort of a new challenge.
Well, I'll say this about the attention economy. There are several studies out there, scientific medical studies, that show that this attention, the social media, tying this into happiness, it actually makes you more depressed. Social media makes you more depressed. It does not make you happier. So this is kind of how both of your books tie together.
Yes.
In that social media, whatever it's like an addiction. They found that social media, the effects are similar to being addicted to some of the worst drugs out there, and that you just keep wanting more, and it ends up making you more and more depressed because you could be comparing yourself to other people or who knows what. But I just wanted to...
Right. No, yeah. And I think that's because, again, the goal is not to make you want to stay on social media by being happy, but the goal is also not to make you depressed. The goal is just like whatever it takes to keep you there. So as a user of Twitter, I can testify that what it takes to keep people there a lot is whatever makes them angriest.
That's
because
true. Yeah.
Things that make you angry are very compelling. You know, the guy who cuts you off in traffic is he has your attention. So
you don't tell your friends about the nice person who lets you move over lanes.
Right, exactly. And it's a bit like, people say about evolution, right? Part of the reason happiness is such a challenge for us, I think, is that evolution doesn't really care. I mean, care in quotes, obviously, but doesn't really care about you being happy. It cares about you spreading your genes to the next generation. And if being agitated and miserable is the most effective way to do that, then fine. So we have to sort of take this into our own hands and say, we're not sort of necessarily naturally predisposed to being happy, and the corporate ecosystem that we live in is not necessarily predisposed to making us feel happy. So it's going to be up to us to try to pursue meaningful lives in an attempt to be happy.
I read that several years ago, you asked some friends to guess how many weeks make up a typical human lifetime, and it sounds like they missed the ball by a whole lot. What do you think led them to have such? I mean, people in general are intelligent. What do you think about time and like lifespans make people be so far off in their views of how long we actually have to live?
Oh yeah, right. This is just when I first made this calculation about sort of 4,100 and something weeks. The tiny number that you get if you live to 80. I asked a bunch of my friends just as after I'd had the panic attack, in response to that, I asked various friends, I very deliberately said, don't do any mental arithmetic, because people can work it out pretty easily if they start doing the math in their head, obviously. And yeah, one of my friends said something like 150,000. People are just sort of plucking figures out of the air. I mean, part of that, I think, is the weeks aspect of this, right? It's like a week seems so trifling in the course of our lives that there must just be a vast number of them. It can't just be 4,000 in an average lifespan because they're so brief. But well, that sort of goes to my point that actually the life itself only adds up to something rather brief. And then, yeah, I'm sure on some level there's something subconscious going on there, which is that you don't want to sort of confront mortality. You want to feel like time stretches off forever and ever and ever and ever. And the fact that if I sort of drew a little box for each of the weeks I have left on a piece of paper, I could probably, it would just be a fairly big poster on my wall instead of, covering the whole of my city, is kind of alarming. It's not something people want to dwell on. But as I say in the book as well, the funny thing there is that 150,000 weeks, if you double that and add a few, 310,000 weeks, that's actually the approximate length of time that there has been any human civilization since the ancient Sumerians. So it's kind of wild. Not only are our individual lives brief, but everything we think of as having been around for just forever has really not been around for very long.
That's true. Now, do you think with COVID-19 and with the pandemic and all of the stuff that's been going on, do you think people have been trending towards being more productive and having better management of their lives, or have they been trending more towards trying to find that elusive happiness in their lives?
I think it's definitely thrown us in some really interesting ways. So, obviously it's been awful for many, many people, but I think it has had the effect of sort of jolting their perspective. Lots of people have found it, I know, incredibly hard to get anything done, especially in the sort of more lockdown phases of the pandemic, even partly because, the schools are closed and they've got kids at home. But even if they haven't, there's been this very widespread phenomenon, I think, of people not really being able to make any progress on things, even when they do have the free time to do it, and in fact more time than before. Very strange effects in all sorts of ways that sort of losing the temporal guideposts from your life, the commute, the beginning of the working day, the end of the working day. There's a very strange effect that happens when you lose these. But I also think it's been quite powerful because people have been deprived of things that they didn't realize how much they would miss them. The example I give is like I sang in an amateur choir, and I liked it, but I didn't realize I was going to miss it so badly when it was when suddenly singing in a choir became one of the most dangerous things you could do in the pandemic. And on the other hand, I think a lot of other people were like, oh, hang on, now I'm not commuting, and I'd really like to start never commuting. Now I have to do nothing but water the plants in the backyard. I'd like there to be more space in my life for watering the plants in the backyard. So I saw somebody else, another writer, compare this to Marie Kondo, who says you sort of like you should like sort of assume that everything in your life, every item in your closet is going, and only retain then the ones that spark joy. And there is a kind of equivalent thing that we maybe have the chance to do now, which is say like, okay, turns out a whole society can suddenly stop commutes and all sorts of other things. So given that this is possible, what might be possible in my life to what things could I bring back, and what things could I resist bringing back? And of course, people have different levels of economic sway and privilege, and it's not going to be easy for everyone to do whatever they want. But you have all these reports now of people kind of chucking in their jobs at both ends of the socioeconomic scale. I think partly because they're just like, oh, hang on, if I'm going to do something really cool, it's going to be now.
Yeah, absolutely. We have been joined today by Oliver Burkeman, New York Times bestselling author of The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and his new book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. Oliver, is there anything else you want to let our listeners know, or anything else you want to promote?
No, that's it. It's 4,000 Weeks is the book I have out now, so I'm very happy if anyone wants to consider checking that out as a book or an audiobook. It'd be wonderful.
All right, if you want to check that out, go to oliverburkeman.com. That's Oliver, and then Burkeman is Burkeman. We'll have that in the show notes, so check that out, oliverburkeman.com. For all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's workfromhomeshow.com. Leave us a review on any of the podcast platforms. We'd really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about any of our shows, email us, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. And until next week, keep on working from home.